So I'm going to go ahead and start recording. Okay, and I think it is going. So again, welcome. Let's go ahead and dive into the presentation itself. I'm going to share my screen. Share sound. All right. I kind of can see you all in the top right corner of my screen, so please let me know if anybody cannot see this presentation that I'm sharing. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see it. If not, please feel free to chime in. So let's take a look. We're going to look at some core concepts and also current challenges. This has been a unique time for the city of Oakland budget-wise. This is one of according to some of the staffers that I talked to in City Hall, this has probably been one of the most challenging periods in 50 years of city budgeting. Although some of those people have not worked for the city for 50 years, they say that this is certainly the most challenging environment in decades budget-wise. So for tonight, we are going to talk a little bit about the process of the budget. The mayor's office has asked that I share 3 videos that they have put together. It's about, I don't know, 8 or 9 minutes in total across the 3 of them. With that information, we'll look at the current situation about the budget, specifically some of the underlying factors, and then kind of take a longer term outlook as to what might be happening. So again, as I go through this, please feel free to chime in with any questions you have, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so about the process itself, the city of Oakland is typically on a 2-year fiscal cycle. And the fiscal year starts on July 1st of every odd numbered year. So we are essentially getting ready in this current budget preparation process right now for the next fiscal year starting July 1st. And so essentially we're kind of give or take halfway through that process. And the first part of the budget process is pretty quiet, but things are going to start getting interesting here in about, well, a couple of weeks. And then there's going to be about 2 months of frenetic activity. And if all goes well, the city council will, they have to pass a balanced budget by June 30th of every odd numbered year. But a lot will happen over the next couple of months. And we'll get into that in just a second. So once the budget is passed by June 30th and July 1st kicks off the new 2-year fiscal cycle, there will be a series of quarterly R&E or revenue and expenditure reports. So you have to remember that the budget is the budget bureaus and the mayor's office and city council's best estimates as to what revenues are going to come in. And then against those expected revenues, they then will make certain decisions about allocating for expenditures. But nobody really knows exactly how much money is going to come in. So these quarterly R&E reports are sort of like actuals against the projection. And if actuals veer significantly away from projections, they'll have a what's called a mid-cycle adjustment, or sort of a true up, in which they will bring the projections back in line with the actual. So if less revenue is coming in than expected, they'll make corresponding reductions in expenditures for the mid-cycle adjustment. So the 2-year cycle moves on. There's additional R&E reports that come in that help guide and inform the actual amount of revenues and expenditures for the city. And then by the end of the fiscal year cycle, again, that budget needs to be balanced. And toward the end of that fiscal year cycle, the next budget preparation or budget season, if you want to call it that, will start up. So let's zoom back into this first process where we are now. Let's take a closer look at this. So what's going to happen what either has happened and what's going to happen this year. So if you're not aware, and I can send the link out for this later, the Budget Advisory Commission sponsors a citizens poll every 2 years, again, kind of at the beginning of the odd numbered years. I think this year it went out to about 1,600 residents all across the city. Every sort of geographic and demographic area is represented. And those poll results have come back. And again, if we have time at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to share that with you. And I certainly share the link if you want to read through it in greater detail. But long story short, this poll is then presented to City Council in early March to help give them a little context around what residents are thinking and feeling about their priorities for the city budget. So then the council members will draw up their own statements of their own priorities by mid-March. Those are all published on the page that you see down here at the bottom, oaklandca.gov/budget. So feel free to go through those if you're interested. The Budget Bureau in the City Administrator's Office also releases this 5-year financial forecast, and we're going to look through some of the charts in that tonight. The council members do a budget workshop. They essentially do a retreat and spend a lot of time with the Budget Bureau to get a deeper understanding of the numbers and some of the internal things going on within the city's budget before they're asked to make a decision on how to allocate expenditures. Okay, so that kind of brings us to almost today. The mayor's budget should be coming out on May 1st, which happens to be a Saturday, so it might come out a day early. And the mayor puts forth a blueprint of her proposed budget, her priorities, and what she thinks it should look like. And then that kicks off a series of town hall events, which will be happening in all council districts. All 7 council districts across the city should be having one of these town hall events. For those of us here in District 4 in Sheng Tao's council district, I pinged Brandon, her aide, a couple days ago, and I've not yet heard back on when that event might be. I'm guessing it hasn't been scheduled yet. But anyway, if we all want a chance to, I would say go to, but these days dial in to Councilmember Tao's budget forum event, then we would have the chance to hear from her and ask questions of her about her priorities. By about mid-June, the council president will propose amendments to the mayor's budget, and the Budget Advisory Commission will also provide a presentation from our commission. And with those inputs, there are final couple weeks or so of deliberations. And again, the council is required by city charter to pass a balanced budget for the next 2 years.
In Millbrae, they're doing mixed use, and it's a huge project. But
hey, Daniel.
That requirement is just not commercially, financially viable.
Daniel?
So for Alexis, I'm just thinking how we
Oops.
On piece.
Sorry, Jay, I'm just wrapping up my Laurel District Board meeting, but I wanted to get in here.
Oh, okay.
See if I could multitask.
No worries. If I could ask you just to put on mute, please. There's a bit of background noise. Thanks. Okay, so we have at this point by June 30th, we have the council has passed a 2-year budget for the next fiscal cycle. So that's what's going on these days right now. So let's go ahead and jump over to the videos that were provided by the mayor's office. Here they are. So the first one's kind of an introductory video, and then the videos 2 and 3 have a little bit more meat to them, if you will. Let me know if you can all, or if anyone has trouble hearing these, please put it in the chat. The question is, can I hit play here?
Welcome to part one of our budget series. Today we're going to talk about why does government matter and what does it pay for? So often we forget how much local government makes our lives better. The roads we drive on, the parks we enjoy with our families, the public schools we attended, go Skyline Titans, and even, unfortunately, that 911 call we have to make sometimes when a loved one is experiencing a medical emergency. Government makes our lives better, and that's why the City of Oakland's budget should matter to you. But know that not all public services are in the city's budget. In fact, the majority of local government spending in Oakland actually resides in other budgets, like public education is in the Oakland Unified School District and Peralta Community College's budget. Public transit, it's in AC Transit and BART. Many of our beautiful parks are actually funded by East Bay Regional Parks District. And so many of our most critical services, things like public health, that includes mental health, our criminal justice system, and our social services, including services for our homeless population, are provided by Alameda County. The city's budget focuses mostly on public safety, police and fire, on public works, those roads, our sewer system, storm drains, and community development, parks, libraries, affordable housing, job training. So just because you don't see things that you care about, like education or mental health, transit, in the City of Oakland's budget, doesn't mean that we don't care about those issues. We encourage you to not just get knowledgeable about the City of Oakland's budget, but get involved with other local governments and their budgeting processes.
Okay, that's video one. That's sort of the intro level one. Let me see if we can get the second one going here.
Welcome to part two of our Oakland budget series. Why is budgeting so hard? Well, there are two main things that make budgeting so hard. One is when our costs are going up a lot faster than the money we're taking in. And the second is the many restrictions that come on the money that we have that dictates how we must spend it according to the law. So let's talk about those costs versus revenues. We start with an annual budget of $1.5 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. But the truth is that 90% of it can only be spent on particular things. That means that only 10% is completely discretionary. So if we start with $1.5 billion, right off the top, about 40% is required to be spent on voter initiatives that you voted for the library, violence prevention, children's programs, and transportation. Or it's dedicated by law or policy to be spent on specific uses like sewer repair, affordable housing, illegal dumping cleanup, recycling, and parks. Or it's grant funds that we won through competitions, but they have to be used for the specific purposes. That is a huge chunk of the budget so far. Another quarter goes to pay for required expenses like debt service, insurance, pension bonds, overhead, and internal spending. So now we're up to 2/3 of the total budget that is restricted. Another 1/5 of the total is required by labor contracts or voter mandates to be spent on minimum staffing for fire and police. Once all those required expenditures are accounted for, only about 1/10 of the total budget is available for every other government service we provide. For every dollar we spend, 90 cents of it is already spoken for. It's just that last dime that we can move around. But that last dime has to cover all sorts of basic government functions, like our revenue collectors, our IT department, our human resources department, things that we need to just keep government moving. So unfortunately, we don't have as much discretion as you would think. Hopefully, you can get involved also in that 10% of discretionary funding. That's where we have the most ability to change what we're doing now.
Okay, and last but not least, number 3 from somebody that I've worked with closely over the years on the Budget Advisory Commission.
Hi, I'm Brad Johnson, Assistant Budget Administrator for the City of Oakland. Let's discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic will affect Oakland's fiscal year 21-23 budget, as well as how you can get involved in advocating for a budget that reflects your priorities. The COVID-19 pandemic has decimated our national and our local economies. The lockdowns ordered by our health officials and general slowdown of economic activity over the past year dramatically reduced our tax revenues, especially sales tax, hotels tax, and parking tax. Even before COVID, Oakland had struggled with other financial challenges, including an ongoing structural deficit, unfunded retiree liabilities, and deferred maintenance of our city infrastructure. Just last June, the city had to resolve a substantial budget shortfall during our mid-cycle budget update to meet the requirement of having a balanced budget. We did it by freezing vacant positions, suspending payments to address retiree healthcare liabilities, and by using all of the city's rainy day fund. And with even stricter shutdowns in the late fall and winter, our revenues for the current fiscal year, which started last July, are once again below what we budgeted. Seeing this fiscal crisis, the city administration imposed a hiring freeze and spending controls to help keep the city solvent. These were very difficult suspensions of critical city services, including police overtime, a fire engine, and more than 500 workers who mostly served our parks and libraries. But even with all those sacrifices, Oakland is still projected to end the fiscal year with a $44 million deficit. Looking ahead to Oakland's upcoming fiscal 21-23 two-year budget, we project a staggering shortfall estimated at $174 million in the general purpose fund. When combined with the current year's deficit, Oakland will need to resolve $218 million in general purpose fund projected shortfalls in just the next few months. Additionally, there's another $100 million projected shortfall across other city funds. Altogether, our elected leaders will have to address more than $318 million in projected shortfalls over the next 3.5 months. However, the city did recently receive some good news. The American Rescue Plan Act from the federal government will certainly provide relief. This $1.9 trillion package, recently signed by President Biden, is the first to include direct aid to local governments, specifically to address our revenue losses, while continuing to send more direct aid to our most vulnerable residents and small businesses. The City of Oakland will receive an estimated $192 million in American Rescue Plan funds to help address our massive revenue losses. It is not the full amount we'd need to completely address our projected $318 million shortfall, but it's much closer to closing the gap. And it takes us from considering catastrophic reductions to only difficult ones. In my 11 years working here at the City of Oakland, I've seen how the public's participation and advocacy influences our final adopted budget. There are a lot of ways to stay engaged and have your voice heard. The mayor will incorporate your feedback into her proposed budget, which she will present to the City Council no later than the 1st of May. During the months of May and June, City Council members will have more town hall meetings and more conversations on social media. By the 17th of June, the Council President will publish an amended version of the mayor's budget for the City Council to consider. The Council as a whole must adopt a final balanced budget no later than June 30th. We want you to be part of this conversation and help to create a budget that is responsive to your needs. Keep informed by visiting oaklandca.gov/budget. Follow your elected officials on social media and contribute budget questions on our Thought Exchange. Thank you for watching our City of Oakland budget series. We are counting on you to let us know your priorities. We appreciate you taking the time to learn about the city's budget. Please keep your budget questions coming. We'll be sure to answer them throughout the budget process. Thank you for being an engaged resident and for loving Oakland.
You're on mute, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you. I will pause here if anybody has any questions about what we all just saw.
Gulp.
Yep, that's one way to put it. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Hey Jay, this is Rachel. I'm wondering how much revenue you're getting from the marijuana business in Oakland. If the taxes on that has been helpful to the city. Do you happen to know?
That is a good question. I'm going to take that down. So cannabis tax revenue.
It just seems huge, and maybe it's not doing what I thought it would do for the city.
Yeah. I'm going to put that in sort of as a parking lot item, if that's okay. And
Sure, no problem.
if we have time, get back to you. I don't have an answer off the top of my head, but thank you. Thank you for asking that.
Okay.
Zondelay, Daniel, anything from your perspectives?
Ms. Zondelay, I don't have any comments. Thank you.
Okay.
No, thank you, Jay. I think that was great. I actually just pulled up the city's website to get a sense of the calendar, which I hadn't seen considering the COVID scenario, but I've been familiar with it in the past. So good to know some of the dates and what gets made public. I don't know if you know where the CIP project breakdown materializes in that calendar process, or if it's been available and I'm just not finding it anywhere. But that was one thing I was interested in.
The calendar for the CIP, the capital improvement program.
Well, my understanding is DOT and everybody's made their recommendations for projects to be funded. So that exists somewhere, but I don't know if it's public yet, or if you've seen it, and I just can't find it.
I have seen, and let me take that down as a parking lot item too. So the CIP information or capital improvement program information on the website. Yeah, let's. I think I know where that is, but we'll take a look at that at the end if that works. And just to briefly catch you up, Daniel, here's a slide that we reviewed earlier. If you were curious, I think you're already at least somewhat familiar with these events and sort of the budget cycle and all the events that lead up to the passage by June 30th. So we should be getting the mayor's proposed budget, I think, in a couple of weeks from today. And that's when all the fireworks and shenanigans start happening. So. Okay, great, thank you. So here is a great thing published by openbudgetoakland.com, essentially a group, a subsidiary group of openoakland.com, which is a group of, I think they call themselves civic hackers, who try to leverage technology to make Oakland's city processes better. And so this particular group has come up with some data visualizations, taking data from Oakland's Oracle financials system and making diagrams such as these. And I happen to love this one. To me, it just kind of puts it all there on one page where you can see the different categories of revenue coming into the city and the relative size of each of those revenues. And you can kind of see generally whether they flow into the one discretionary fund, the general purpose fund, which represents about 40% of Oakland's total budget of $1.6 billion, or 650 million of that total. And then the other, I think there are up to 120 restricted special purpose funds now that deal with things like ballot measures, grants, funds that repay bonds and things of that nature. For those who may not be as aware of that, so 60% of Oakland's total budget is largely off limits to the council, meaning they can't just go in and change things in that willy-nilly. And then you can see kind of the outflows here, right? So big outflows from the general fund are feeding the police department and the fire department. Big outflows from the non-discretionary funds are what they kind of generically call non-departmental and port. That includes a lot of debt repayment, retirement plan contributions, and so forth. And then a big chunk of non-discretionary funds is also feeding the Oakland Public Works Department. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the current situation. This is a brief recap of what Brad had said in the video, but maybe it helps to see it visually. And again, please chime in with any questions as I go through this. I tried to list the source of where I found this information for each one of these slides. So if you want to look at greater detail, you certainly can. So at the beginning of this current fiscal cycle, which is the two squares in gray, if you will, right? A balanced budget was passed back pre-pandemic, July 1st of 2019. And things were moving along through the fiscal cycle, if you will, and toward the end of that first year of the fiscal year, in March, the coronavirus crisis hits. And the revenue situation deteriorates pretty quickly and pretty severely. And we talked about the mid-cycle process, the truing up process that happens in the middle of each two-year fiscal cycle. That happened at by June 30th of 2020. And the true up amount ended up being somewhere in the neighborhood of $120 million across all funds, right? So that's both general purpose fund and all those restricted funds. From what I've heard from folks in the budget office, that this was sort of, if you can imagine, sort of wringing a wet towel and sort of getting all the easy water squeezed out of that, right? They used kind of whatever buffers they had in terms of a rainy day fund. They stopped contributing to certain retiree healthcare obligations and plans. And they kind of did some fund transfers and some accounting tricks, if you will, to soften the blow, but they managed to avoid any staff layoffs except for the 500 temporary part-time workers that kind of cycle in and out of the Oakland Parks Department. So that happened. Unfortunately, as those quarterly revenue and expenditure reports started coming in every 3 months, the revenue projections, the actual revenues that the city was realizing were essentially going down. They were getting worse than were anticipated even during the mid-cycle adjustment. So it looked like basically more pain is on the horizon. So as Brad mentioned, right, the federal government came to the rescue, and we're getting hopefully $192 million of relief from the federal economic stimulus. This cash will come in over the next 2 years. Believe the first installment of that cash is supposed to come in very soon. Council voted, I believe, just last week or recently to use 58 million of that 192 to essentially balance the deficit of the current fiscal year. So assuming all goes well, we should be balanced, although at a reduced level of expenditure for the current fiscal year. And then the remaining $133 million is going to be allocated toward addressing what Brad sort of indirectly referred to as the $274 million projected deficit for the next fiscal cycle, shown in green here on the right. And that's across all funds. He mentioned 174 in the general fund and another 100 or so in the remaining restricted funds. So here's a little so this goes into the 5-year financial forecast doc that came out. And this looks at the next 2 years, which is the next fiscal cycle that we're looking at, creating a budget for by June 30th. And then it projects an additional 3 years out. And this document is designed to give council members sort of a longer range horizon in which to do their planning and to help make decisions around this current budget cycle. So you can see here in the last couple of years here what some of the hits were to various revenue sources. Sales tax, of course, dropped, right, as people stopped going, patronizing businesses. Business license tax, which is generally based on a business's revenue, dropped off pretty significantly here. A couple of other revenue sources saw much more, although they're actually smaller numbers, they saw much more dramatic decreases in revenue. So the transient occupancy tax is kind of a fancy way of saying the tax that hotels pay for visitors who come to Oakland. From what I learned actually from Brad was that a big chunk of that is actually pilots and flight attendants from the various airlines coming in and just staying overnight at the little handful of airports, at the handful of hotels near the Oakland airport is actually a big source of revenue, and that dropped off dramatically this year. Parking tax, of course, as people are staying home, they are not spending money out parking, and that the same thing goes for the airport as well. So even when revenues recover, as this 5-year financial forecast is expecting that they will, you can actually see that revenues are expected to increase fairly significantly as knock on wood, the economy recovers and life slowly gets back to normal. Well, there's some pretty deep fiscal deficits to deal with in the near term, right? So, sorry, I lost my cursor for a sec. So the 274 million that we talked about earlier is the cumulative deficit over the next projected deficit over the next 2 years. 160 plus 114. And as you can see, even though revenues are improving, one of the ongoing problems with the city's budget is that expenses, even before COVID, were increasing at a slightly faster rate than revenues were. And this is when the economy was doing well a couple of years ago. So you can see that these deficits, these projected deficits, are getting smaller. So that's sort of the silver lining to a rather gray cloud. Okay, so why the structural deficits? Well, to put a little bit of context around this, this is the head count for the city over the last 20 some odd years. And during the Great Recession, as you can see, the city's headcount dropped pretty dramatically as the city was forced to deal with layoffs and furloughs and things like that. The one thing, and I'll back up just a second here. So here are all these different sources of revenue that got hit. The one that did not get hit or hasn't gotten hit yet is property tax, and that's a big one. So the real estate market is still very healthy due to high prices. And I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but the number of transfers of real estate, which is also a taxable event that is a source of revenue for the city, has been fairly healthy from what I hear. So part of the reason we have not seen, at least yet, these sort of dramatic layoff scenarios is that the property tax and the real estate transfer tax as sources of revenue have remained fairly healthy. So after this Great Recession happened, as you can see, the economy improved and the city slowly staffed back up. So the 5-year projection assumes, and this is a base assumption, which is certainly subject to change, it assumes consistent levels of staffing and consistent levels of services as existed just before the pandemic. So if you maintain that level of expenditure while revenues are slowly catching up, you're going to continue to run that structural deficit. That's one factor. It also helps to understand by looking at what I call the cost of people versus things. So people here is shown in various shades of green, and non-people expenses are shown here in shades of yellow or gold. And so the city provides this sort of high-level categorization of their expenditures. And so you can see wages plus fringe benefits plus retirement contributions take up about 55% of the all funds budget of the city. And the remaining 45% is used for material, equipment, supplies, utilities, debt repayment, things of that nature. Here's sort of another way to look at that same data, but with actual numbers. So what you see here again are sort of the green, what I call the people-related expenses, and the yellow or gold operations and maintenance related expenses, which also includes the debt and the transfer and some other items. I also wanted to show here is the city projected sort of annual average increases over those 5 years. Again, these are all projections, but notice that the what they call fringe benefits or the medical benefits, medical, dental, vision, and probably a handful of other things are projected to increase, fairly significantly over the years. I think 7.2% from what I understand is not even that much. I've seen in the private sector, 10, 15, 20% year over year increases in some cases. Here's another way of looking at the cost of employees. So across this, every position is different, every, sort of rank or seniority is different. But if you look at the whole pool of employees across the city of Oakland and just sort of assume an average base wage rate of $100,000, you can see that over the cost of the next 5 years, compared to that $100,000 base wage, the city has to put in an extra $30,000 or so for fringe benefits, and on top of that, another 40 or so thousand in terms of retirement contributions. So we're now looking at $170,000 fully loaded cost for somebody who's earning $100K a year in salary. It's a pretty expensive undertaking. Okay, and we're just kind of closing out with kind of a longer look at things. These are the primary, what are called unfunded liabilities that Oakland is currently facing. Oakland has 2 active plans with CalPERS, one for public safety employees and another for what they call miscellaneous employees, which are basically anybody who's not police and fire. Those plans are funded somewhere in the 65 to 70% ratio currently, based on the last numbers that I've seen. What that means that in those plans, they have 70% of what a CalPERS actuary has determined that they should have. So if say they were supposed to have $1 billion in that plan, there's only about 700 million, and there's that unfunded liability. So right now that unfunded liability is at about 1.5 billion for CalPERS. The retiree healthcare plan that the city has been just chronically underfunded and malnourished for years. That unfunded liability has grown to $850 million. And then this PFERS, or Police and Fire Retirement System, which actually was the old public safety plan from, I think it closed in the late 80s. But believe it or not, it is still supporting, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 550 active police and fire retirees. And in spite of issuing debt in the last 10 years to help shore up that plan, essentially the city offered bonds, raised a bunch of money, put it in that plan. But the thing is, they have to now pay, of course, the debt back on those bonds. All right, and in case you're wondering, like, this just sounds absolutely awful. It is, but we are not alone in this regard by any means. So here is a group that does this annual study of the largest 100 US public pension plans, that is at the state level and at the very large city and very large county level. And so here's essentially what they found, right? Of these 100 plans, you can sort of see in the dark blue here. Actually, let me start with the light blue. These are the assets in aggregate for those 100 plans. And here in dark blue are the projected liabilities for those 100 plans. And the difference, of course, is shown here in orange. And if it's below, it's all a deficit. So we're looking, give or take, in just those 100 biggest plans across the country, at about $1.5 trillion aggregate deficit. Another way to look at that is the funded ratios, again, for those large pension plans. As you can see over here, it kind of hovers in the 70% range, and the most recent take, according to this group, was at about 70.7%. So we in Oakland are just slightly below that. I think it's 67 or 68% last I saw. Okay, with that, I will stop here. I'm also going to pop this form in the, shoot, I lost it. I'm going to pop this URL in the chat for you all so that you can, where are we? Please take. Please feel free to take this survey to offer not only your thoughts on the usefulness of this ambassador program, but on your thoughts on the budget and how you may or may not want to be engaged in the process going forward. So, and I will send this deck to you all later as well. But here are a few links if you really want to nerd out on this stuff that you can dive down into. And I will stop talking, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions you all have.
I just put one in the chat, Jay, saying, what do you think is the risk is of the city? I mean, some cities around the country have actually declared bankruptcy. I mean, when your liabilities so exceed your assets, and should these trends not reverse, at some point you can't cut enough staff to keep vital services alive and fund multi-billion dollars unfunded liabilities.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. There was one of the things that we on the BAC are going to be most likely encouraging the council to do is to not to avoid at all costs dipping into, for those of you who may not be aware, the city's is required to keep 7.5% reserve amount, so of the general fund amount. So 7.5% of the $650 million, which I think works out to a little bit less than $50 million in reserve. If the city taps that, then they have to declare a fiscal emergency. And according to the people in the Budget Bureau that I've spoken with, that opens up a massive can of worms and will negatively impact for many years the city's standing in the debt market. So we're going to most likely advocate that not happen. Sort of a side corollary answer to your question, Pam. The city, I mean, again, they're sort of have their hands tied with certain labor agreements, primarily with police and fire, which happen to be the most expensive departments in the city. There are certain minimum staffing levels and no layoff clauses, absent a declaration of fiscal emergency. So I honestly think that the city is going to have to look very hard, and they've started doing that last summer before that got put on the shelf, is looking at revisiting the business license tax rates to make it more progressive, such that the Kaisers and the some of these other mega employers here in the city are going to be paying a progressively higher rate. At the same time, they're also looking to relax the business license tax on those small businesses that I think have less than 250,000 in annual revenue, or potentially some other source of revenue to help close that structural gap that we saw earlier that's not getting closed. I guess that's my immediate answer, but I'm open to other thoughts.
It sounds like dipping into that reserve is kind of the nuclear option, which then starts this cascade. I mean, nobody wants to declare bankruptcy, but I mean, it's, I guess, good the city's not alone, but this is huge across the country with and this has been in a time when the investment markets have actually been doing remarkably well, and the pension issue is still a challenge, in part because of such low interest rates.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in a weird way. Equity markets are taking off, and the returns on bonds and other fixed income instruments is just flying barely above the treetops. Thank you. Any other questions, folks?
Well, I personally really appreciate this summary and having the slide deck sent. It is a massive challenge that the folks involved in the budget process have ahead of them.
Yes, it is. And you may remember I think the first video, and this was sort of news to me initially, that not only is 60% of the total budget untouchable by council, but Libby Schaff was saying that it's really 90% when you think of all the encumbrances on parts of the general fund as well, and those ballot measures that are drawing on general fund money, and as I mentioned, the staff, the labor agreements that restrict certain staffing levels, things like that. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room here.
I wanted to, Sondela, I too wanted to just concur. I appreciate you having this being presented, because it gave me information and understanding that I had no idea to the level of devastation and the process and the restrictions and just, you know, everything that was in the mayor's video in which you've been outlining with the slides, that it just gave me understanding. I don't know, and that's why I wanted to come on and learn and hear some things about it. But now I understand the not, why there's not a response and why things aren't getting done, and people are saying, you know, that that we don't have the funds, when, you know, we would think that we would, because when you know, we feel that, and especially when you add in the COVID unexpected adjustment that no one was prepared for, view of it, it was just really insightful for me. And I'm going to stop talking now, because basically that's all I wanted to say, was that it was just helpful for me to get some understanding.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great to hear. Daniel, any thoughts on your end?
Oop.
Nope. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, again, thank you all for dialing in. Please do feel free to fill out that survey, because they want to hear that these ambassador programs are happening, and they want to know what you think, if they're useful, and if you found the information helpful. So
It'll be helpful if you send it to me at my email. You know, I can't do stuff on my phone. This is Zondalay speaking. I'd be happy to do so, but I can only do if you send it to me at the email.
yeah, no, I'll be happy to send out a PDF copy of this deck to all of you. So in case you're feeling too cheerful about something and need something to bring you down. All right.
Yeah, thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thank you all for joining, and have a great evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, talk soon. Bye.